welcome everybody. If you could keep your microphones on mute, and we'll have questions at the end. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, if you could pop them in the chat, Randall will kindly answer them at the end. But if you could just keep muted for the time being, and then hopefully he'll be able to concentrate on what he's saying for the duration. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll just wait a few more minutes just to make sure we've got everybody in the room that wants to join us, and then I'll hand over to you in a minute, Randall.
That's fine, Amy.
Hi, Olive. Sorry I had to leave so abruptly earlier.
Amy, if when I start the video, you could unspotlight me.
Yes.
Because there's no point in people watching me while they're watching the video, because they'll get double vision.
Yeah, completely understand. Okay, so we've had a couple more in. So just to reiterate, if you could keep your microphones off for the duration, and at the end there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. At that time, if you want to raise your hand or pop your questions in the chat at any time, that would be really helpful, and we'll make sure that Randall answers your questions at the end if there's enough time, which I hope there will be. Thank you very much, everybody.
There will be.
Thank you. Okay. Randall, do you want to introduce yourself then? Who are you and what are you talking about? Thank you.
Are you going to start? You've started the recording. Thank you. Yeah. I'm Randall Hardy. Alison described me yesterday as somebody who was longer in the tooth than her in home education, but we're probably about the same length, to be honest. I've been around for a while. It was the Badman era where a lot of us trace our roots back to, and that's certainly when I stepped out to just getting on and being a home educating dad to getting involved in political things. Today's session is going to be slightly different in that I'm not actually presenting myself. I've got a friend who I'll introduce you to in a minute called Tristram, who's been involved in civil liberty campaigning for a long time, and he was also home educated, as he'll tell you, and he's been involved in fighting for educational freedom. And basically, 2 weeks ago, before the Queen's speech, I was on a phone conversation with Tristram, and I said to him, I'm doing a session at Learn Free in a couple of weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, whatever it was. How would you like to have me interview you for it? And he warmed to the idea. But then we decided that we wouldn't do it live because he's a bit of a nervous fellow. So he came over to my house last week, and we've recorded this interview, which is what I'm going to show you now. It's about 35 minutes long, so that'll leave us plenty of time, 20 minutes for discussion, for questions afterwards. So we'll take it from there. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I will disappear from your screens, I hope, when I do. And I hope everything runs well. So let's see where we get to. Yep, share sounds on.
That's viewing well.
I'm Randall Hardy, and I'm speaking today to Tristram Llewellyn Jones, who's been involved in civil liberty campaigning for quite some time. Just so you know, this is being recorded a week after the schools bill was published. It was arranged before then, but obviously the schools bill publication has changed everything we're doing. But I'm sure many of the points will be there. So welcome, Tristram, and let's get going and find out a little bit about yourself. I understand that your first encounter of home education was when you were quite young.
Yes, thank you for having me on the interview, and hello to everybody. That's correct. So I was at British Primary School in Suffolk, a farmer's son, and I went off to a large public school in the area. My primary school education was basic but very sound, but the public school environment was far broader, more subjects, and I simply hadn't been prepared for it. So to cut a long story short, I became a school refuser and was educated at home.
Good, right. And that benefited you, did it?
It's benefited me because it suited my personality and temperament, which is self-reliant, and I naturally teach myself. There was a disbenefit because the local authority rapidly ejected. I got involved with my parents and tried to take control of the situation, and we couldn't get a shot of them. That went on for a number of years, and it put an awful lot of stress on my parents. It achieved absolutely nothing, either for us or the local authority. It imprinted on my mind that this was a fundamentally unjust regime that was operating.
Well, we're not going to go on that because we all know that side of the things. But one of the things about today is people say, well, you're just not equipping children for life if you're home educated. Were you hindered by what you did?
Far from it. Family life is the bedrock of our society. That has to be good. In my case, I was a farmer's son. I actually was working on the farm at the age of 15, driving a combine harvester, was responsible enough to have a firearm certificate at 14, a shotgun certificate, and a motorbike. And at the age of 15, 16, I was actually working, doing real things, and that's fine.
Good. And so what did you do work-wise after the farm?
I stayed working on my parents' farm because my father died when I was 14, helping my mother till I was about 20. But I developed a love of flying at a gliding club, went along to the RAF careers office, and they said, yes, have a go. But I hadn't actually got any A-levels, so they said, go away for a year, manufacture 5 O-levels and come back. So that's what I did.
But home education is really isolated and people think you won't cope in an atmosphere like the RAF. Did they worry about that?
Not in the slightest. I asked them at the interview if they were bothered by my home education, and they said it's not held against you in any way whatsoever. And that says one thing about society in 1981. They weren't interested in the archive. They were interested in your potential. They saw somebody they could train who was keen, and that was a large part of their decision.
Good. So just one final question on your background. I know you've got children. I assume, having had such a positive experience back from the local authority of home education, it was always your plan to home educate them?
I had forgotten completely about being home educated from the age of 16 when it was no longer an issue with the local authority and I had my freedom, as it were. Wasn't in our thinking at all until we found ourselves in a truly dreadful primary school, which had no interest in the future of the children, with the prospect of a rubbish secondary school. So lots of discussions. We decided that actually we liked education so much we would do it ourselves.
And you went forward from there?
Correct.
Good. Well, let's move on, because I also know that over life you've got involved in campaigning for civil liberties. But it wasn't home education that brought you into that field, was it?
Not in my thoughts at all. I personally objected very strongly to having an identity card. I had one in the RAF. Last thing I did when I left was hand it in the guardroom, got my freedom back. Fine. That was a fairly benign identity card, but the tracking that came with New Labour's identity register, the data behind it was the bigger issue than the card. And that just really annoyed me that my private life should be a matter of government. So that got me into campaigning.
Right.
Successfully. We got rid of identity cards.
You got rid of it?
Yes.
Any lessons that you took with you from there onwards?
Yes, primary legislation can be got rid of. We got rid of primary legislation. It was cancelled by Home Secretary Theresa May. It was an election issue. Public were aware of what's going on. The cancelling of it was not a matter of widespread public campaigning, but actually being very targeted and getting people to help. In my case, British Airline Bar Association were the first refuseniks, so I was liaising with them and also with NATO ID. So that was a big part in the first people who were supposed to use these identity cards said, we are not going to do it.
Right.
Professional airline pilots said, no, this is too much.
And getting rid of primary legislation is very important at the moment for home educators in England.
Well, it can be done. Contact Point, the database of every child, was in primary legislation. That was cancelled. Ideally, you don't want the legislation in the first place, but you can get rid of it.
Good. So, was there any other campaign in those early days that wasn't home educating that you got involved in?
Well, we moved to the Isle of Man in 2005, and the next issue that came up was when the Isle of Man wanted border checks across the Irish Sea. And I got involved in that. That became very interesting. I found myself talking to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and I ended up talking to a peer in the House of Lords, and extensive conversations with the data protection supervisor in the Isle of Man, who operated an open door policy. Public could ask him questions, and that was a real learning experience. So that was the first campaign which got me to the table of a select committee of the Isle of Man Parliament, the Tinwolf.
Right. And was there others on the Isle of Man before home education came on the...
Yes, there were quite a few issues. Medical records, there was the Isle of Man proposal for an identity register with a card. The big one, I was actually alerted to this, oddly enough, by the data protection supervisor, who said, whilst you're campaigning, you need to know about this. And it was New Labour's Every Child Matters agenda. And that took up a couple of years of my life, campaigning to stop the Isle of Man introducing this child tracking scheme.
Right. And the Isle of Man, that wasn't just home education then, it was all children.
The clue was every child.
Right.
And that's the buzzword which is in the legislation, which is in the thinking of the education registers, every child. So that was very interesting. That was a really interesting experience. After a long protracted campaign, the Isle of Man cancelled their children's bill. They scratched it. So no Every Child Matters agenda. The difficulty was they adopted it without the legislation.
That's a little bit of what's happening in Scotland, but we'll come to that in
Yes.
a minute. So we're having an echo of that now in England with the Children's Commissioner wanting a database of all children.
Yes, it's the same one. It's coming round seasonally. Yes,
Right.
seen it before.
And you first encountered it in Every Child Matters.
Correct. It was they wanted to mirror Contact Point in the Isle of Man, basically.
And did you find any evidence of where that was coming from?
Oh, well, ultimately it comes from international committees, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNESCO, whichever it is. These things are generated at that level, and then they're picked up by politicians, quangos, lobby groups, and they end up being enacted in states. So ultimately it's coming from there, but locally it is people with bees in their bonnets about these issues who want to push the every child message.
Because what we've seen in England is 12 years ago about now, we had Bowles and Badman bringing up these very issues in 2009, 2010, and there seems to be some evidence that it wasn't just a novel idea to England, it was indeed coming from other places.
Oh yes, the international moves to do all this. Of course, we don't really know what other countries do unless we choose to do the research. But yes, there's an international push towards this sort of thing. But it is up to states what they do.
Right. So, talking about what states do, we've got this situation in the United Kingdom of devolved nations, and you've already mentioned, I think, the Scottish Named Person Scheme.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about your involvement in that and how it came about?
Certainly. Well, I campaigned on the Every Child Matters agenda, and successfully because it was stopped. There was also a very strong data protection angle to that. So the data protection supervisor was accompanying me around the Isle of Man giving presentations, and the legal side was very important. But I was aware of the Scottish Named Person Scheme and was approached by Schoolhouse Home Education System to say, well, we have heard that you've got this type of business stopped in the Isle of Man. What's your advice? So they asked for my advice. I gave it.
So what was that advice?
Well, the advice was basically that under law, the state can remove your consent to share information if there's evidence of child abuse, which is significant harm. There has to be some vital interest, but every child doesn't trigger a vital interest. So if they want low-level data on your children, they have to get your consent. And that was the advice. Go and get a legal opinion, which they did from human rights and lawyer and social worker Alan Norman. And he said just that, that data protection works on consent. If it's not necessary, they need your consent. And that was basically what the Supreme Court found, and the named person scheme was struck down. It really boils down to something quite simple. If it's not child protection, they need your consent. And that's a Supreme Court judgment, and as I understand it, non-appealable.
The thing there in Scotland, they got a lot of support because it wasn't just home educating families, even though home educators were at the cutting edge of defending that freedom. Do you think that has been a problem in other parts of the UK, that your home educators are a minority?
This business of consent data tracking is always a minority interest. The press never go near it. They only caught up with the named person scheme at the last minute. They won't show interest in home education. It's a debate for a minority of campaigners, civil servants, a few politicians, legislative drafters, QCs. It's a focused, narrow debate. So, are people aware of these things generally? No, but the few that are and understand the implications are the ones that make the difference.
Right. So do we get those people involved by dumping a load of material on them, or are we? Well, is there better ways?
Let's just look at what happened in Scotland. It started with home educators who saw the implications. There were wider implications to saying every child, which is what the named person did. The Christian Institute decided it crossed their remit. They got involved and they decided to set up the no to the named person scheme. So simple, blanket no. Scrap the scheme, not allowed. Now, crucially, no accommodation of we could have a named person in these circumstances. They simply said it was not legal. And they basically very professionally and sensibly ran and funded this campaign against the named person scheme, and ultimately they were successful. So that is a model for a campaign that works.
Right. So let's move on to the English schools bill, and notably clauses 48 to 50, which are the ones that concern the register, but there are other clauses in there about school attendance orders and the registration and registers of, well, not registers of, but of registering independent educational settings, but we'll concentrate on the local authority registers for out of school children. One of my concerns, because we had, who was then a senior, Kate Dixon, who was at the in 2020 a senior civil servant in the Department for Education, saying that this was really, she told a government inquiry into child sex abuse, that the registers were thin end of the wedge to bring in monitoring and assessment. Do you think that's inevitable if this bill gets through?
It is 100% inevitable, because that is how Whitehall works. They play the long game. They play by increments. It's difficult to oppose an increment and then eventually you get the whole scheme. They're always on the same track. They will always come back for more identity cards. They will always come back for more data on children. As simple as that. But it's worth, I think, reviewing what happened in the Isle of Man with the Isle of Man governments on home education. Would you be interested in that?
Yes, please.
Right. In 2009, the Isle of Man government proposed a home education register with the power for any information. Now, a legal opinion was obtained from an Isle of Man advocate, Stephen Corrin, and it was the any information part of it which was most contentious. But there was also, I believe, an equalities issue in singling out one group of people in society for monitoring. So they ended up with a register, but it had to be broadened out to home educated children and children at private school. But they lost the power to gain the information. So it ended up as something which was benign and frankly useless, and not everybody registered. So that was struck down, basically neutered, put away in a basket by a sound legal opinion. Now, if I may fast forward 10 years to 2019,
yeah,
the Isle of Man introduced a bill which basically mirrored the Soley bill. It's pretty much the same wording, so one can speculate as to whether he was behind it. That produced a more involved debate. More legal opinions were raised. We had a legal opinion from Alan Norman, and we had a second legal opinion from Stephen Corrin. And eventually, the Isle of Man cancelled the new education bill, and there are reasons for that which are known.
Right. Do you want to talk about them? Because I remember that the chief civil servant was on record as saying this was one of his particular bugbears and he had to resign for other reasons. Was it just that, or was there more reasons why they?
Right. Well, let's come to the reasons why it was cancelled at the end of the track. The arguments that really stuck, there's one from the Alan Norman report. This is a case of the department looking for a problem rather than having identified one in the first place. In other words, fishing expeditions, which are not legal. The second legal opinion from the local advocate, which probably struck more weight because the Isle of Man has a separate legal system, said these measures are prescriptive, becoming coercive. Coercive, very strong word, not legal. Now, the bill majored on secondary legislation. It crossed many boundaries on education right across the board, was unpopular with the schools, etc., etc. But the key thing in the Isle of Man was that the government or the department could not produce evidence of a problem. The Isle of Man had never issued a school attendance order. 30, 40, 50 home educated children, unlikely to arise. Look at a local authority in the UK, home school attendance orders for home educators are very rare. In a place like the Isle of Man, never happened. So the politicians were saying to themselves two things. Firstly, you've no evidence of a problem, so why do you need more laws? You don't even use the laws you've got. Secondly, this bill is a pig in a poke. We don't know what we're voting for. You're saying vote to give us all these powers to monitor home educators. Once you've voted for it, here's a blank check, we'll come back with the powers, and we haven't debated them. So we don't know what we're doing. So they felt deeply uncomfortable with it. They couldn't see the reason for it, whether or not they liked home education. And eventually the bill was dropped and the chief executive was sent packing.
You are talking about the Isle of Man, though.
I am talking about.
You're not talking about the schools bill in England, because it sounds like it's got the exact same agenda.
Yes, the Isle of Man is a microcosm of the UK. It has a miniature parliament. It works on very similar parliamentary procedures. Everything basically mirrors Westminster scaled down on many fronts. So it's a reasonable comment to say that where the Isle of Man is a test bed for legislation, and it certainly happens that things are tried out in the Isle of Man first, suggested to the Isle of Man government, you might like to try this. It's a litmus test for what might happen in the UK. So home education monitoring, they're professionally opposed in the Isle of Man, was blocked.
Right. Okay. Let's think about another area of what's happening in Britain. I think you've mentioned it with the named person scheme, but the question of GDPR or data protection, again, this is where we are with this bill. It is this open thing. Do you feel this is an area where home educating families really ought to be focusing a lot of their effort at this time?
Yes, because everything I did campaigning in the Isle of Man had a data protection element, and it was basically consent. But sitting behind that is the Human Rights Act. That is exactly what came into the named person judgment. The named person scheme was primarily struck down because Scotland was trying to operate outside its legislative competence, but the Supreme Court in their judgment outlined what those areas were, and the areas were basically human rights and data protection. Clause 48 of the judgment says you can't get at children's information unless it's for their vital interests. You have to ask. And that principle of consent underwrites everything. So a blank check for local authorities to require information from home educators when there is no appearance of a problem, just on the fact of home education, if properly opposed, should be struck down.
Right. And this bill, in the documents that's behind the bill, I forget which one it is at the moment, but actually says not only can the Secretary of State put on in the future any information he wants, that local authorities can add on top of what the Secretary of State requests.
And they will be free to exercise their prejudices. In the Human Rights Memorandum, it says there is a new secular issue where they can inquire about your faith and the degree to which it is practiced. Now that is just an extraordinary thing for them to be able to even consider querying people's faith and their beliefs. That is where this, I think, will flare up. So, but that's one issue. It strikes me they're going to be given a blank check, basically, to exhibit their prejudices and, frankly, be abusive towards families. And what I found from my upbringing, and this is key, my parents really suffered due to the intrusion of the local authority, is what parents don't realise is once the local authority gets involved, how quickly they can take control and direct life on the threat of, you don't play ball with us, you go to court. Now, what happens in court also needs to be understood.
Right. Well, I was going to come on to that. Let's go there, but let's set it in context, because as far as I read it, this bill actually ramps up the whole school attendance order procedure. If you don't register, you're straight in there into a school attendance order. How, up to now, do you think local magistrates have been responding when a school attendance order comes into court? I'm thinking particularly of home educators, but if you've any information on the wider scene.
Well, that's very interesting, because a while ago I was out to dinner with somebody at a family party who is a clerk to a magistrate's court, and when that individual had a glass or two of the local, I thought I'll ask the question. So I asked this character, how do the magistrates actually deal with the school attendance order, let's say when the parents have declined to give the information to the local authority? The response that came back was, well, we deal with three things. We deal with child protection, which is significant harm. That's very serious, but that can take 6 months, although they can get emergency protection orders. The next thing we deal with is education supervision orders. These are usually dealt with simply in a batch. They're triggered by 70% attendance at school. Local authority sends a batch through, we discharge them. And interestingly, the parents usually don't object because these are wayward teenagers, and it gives the local authority the responsibility, which I thought was an interesting comment. Maybe you can see that with a wayward teenager. But then it's home education, and this is really interesting. So the question is, you've got a child who's being educated at home, but the parents haven't told the local authority. That gets to magistrates' court. What do? And the answer was simple. I simply repeat verbatim what this clerk said. The magistrates will have a short discussion amongst themselves to decide on the balance of probabilities whether a suitable education is being given. If they're happy, they strike down the order. Not complicated. They're making an ordinary judgment. Is the child being educated? They're not interested in specifics because they have no barriers to do that. They're just making the judgment that your neighbour or your aunt might make. Very interesting. There was nothing more to say about it than that. There is nothing more to say about it than that.
That's it.
Yes.
Right. Fine. Well, look, let's just go back, because we're getting this change of atmosphere around school attendance orders and the pressure being put on the public, on politicians and on magistrates. You've hinted at this question about faith in what they can gather data on if this bill goes through is presumably being justified by the radicalisation message that's been associated with home education. Do you think with this ramped up school attendance order regime and conversations going round in the media about that, magistrates are liable to alter their approach in future cases?
No, because magistrates are independent. They're the most, along with the colonial courts, it's a very old and ancient English tradition. Magistrates are amongst the most trusted members of the community. No, but they will take their advice from the Sentencing Council, read the Sentencing Council guidelines as to what they say about school orders, school attendance orders. Very little, no. But behind that, necessarily, government now knows that if they can ramp up the environment and create a lot of background discussion, they can move things forward. That's certainly happening. But this happened in Scotland. They said we need to make Scotland the best place for every child and know about every child's well-being. And they got most of the media of the country thinking that way. The named person case went through 2 Scottish courts, and the courts supported the government. Then it got to England, the Supreme Court, and they looked at it all from first principles and said, no, you can't do it.
Right.
It's not legal.
And so that's, let's begin to wrap up on that. The department is saying they desperately need this register because of children they don't know about. Do you think it will work is my first question.
No. They cannot reasonably impose a sanction for not registering. So they're just saying, we'll need a school attendance order. Well, that's the same situation they can say to you at the minute. Are you home educating? Yes. What are you doing? Not telling you. Ooh. Now, argument. Okay, let's not go there for the minute. But certainly not everybody registered in the Isle of Man, and they levied £1,000 fine. So the department, if it thinks it wants to get to every child, it won't. And this is the key point. Look at it from their point of view. They want to access every home educated child with the register. This is not going to work. The policy will fail for its intended purpose. It will not work. And I think it's very powerful. If they can't get to every child, then it doesn't work. Now, there are reasons, legal reasons, why people move around. We certainly had people that I knew of who lived in several jurisdictions. They were never ordinarily resident anywhere. They would never have triggered a register. So it's not going to work. It's not going to find every child they want to find. There are other ways to have relationships with home educators.
So I don't think you're saying that it's not going to work, therefore do nothing about it because it'll fall over.
Correct. It's also not going to work because it will generate intense friction between some families and local authorities, and that will trigger more legal issues.
Right. So we are at the place where we want home educating families to begin, if they've not already begun, to take this seriously and to begin to engage with politicians.
Yes.
Any tips on that as a final comment?
Well, a politician's a member of the community like yourself. They appreciate a short, polite, friendly letter saying, look, there's a problem. Are you prepared to help? Because this really concerns us. Opening gambit. If they bite and they're half interested, write back with all detailed concerns and then engage with them. Ask to speak to the politician. Face to face really does help, and take it from there. The No to the Named Person campaign, the clue is in the no. If you get involved in the middle ground of arguing, well, let's have the scheme, but let's argue how it works, then you're playing into the department's game. That's what they want you to do. Just like Henry V drew the French troops up the hill into the sticky quagmire, where he could do what he wanted with them, they want us to get into a circular debate about, well, let's have a register and we'll chat about the powers. And that will go on forever and they will win. So we really need to say no to the register.
Well, you've just drawn me into another question that's plagued home educators for a long time. Some people have been saying no to the local authority getting involved with you unless they've got a reason for concern. Others have been saying, well, they just want good for our children. Why shouldn't we send them a report every year? Do you think that if we play the same game with register, we're going to lose it?
Well, we do live in a country where Article 8 says we have a right to respect for our private and family life, and that it has to be necessary for the government to get involved. The named person scheme failed because they didn't properly define the necessary. They couldn't prove the necessity of finding every single child. There simply wasn't a case. It's the same with home educators. There is not a necessity for them to check every single child. And that's a reality. The idea that by default home education is a problem is flawed. The government has no evidence of a problem, just as in the Isle of Man.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed the chat.
Thank you. Right. Whoa. Right, everybody. That started off at a 15-20 minutes discussion, and it just flowed, and I thought it was worth there. Megan's already asking if it can be shared on social media. There's a post planned to go out in about half an hour on my personal blog site up there. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute, and it will be on there, so you'll be able to pick that up and share it on social media or anywhere else you want. It won't include this bit. This is part of the Learn Free conference in a sense, but that discussion is there. I want it to go out. Please, I'm now here for questions, for conversations. What have we inspired you to do? And so on. So
Thank you, Randall. That's really helpful. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, please raise your hands if you've got your video on, and I'll get to you. Otherwise, if you just pop your questions in the chat, if you're a bit camera shy, that's perfectly okay. And we'll make sure Randall answers your questions. Thank you, Randall. That's really informative. So do you want to elaborate a little bit more on anything in particular while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions?
Not really. I just felt it was good timing to have that interview lined up, because Tristram's got a lot of hands-on experience in fighting these things. And I think, you know, partly from what was being said earlier in Alison's session, what Tristram said, this personal contact. You know, home educators have been described in the media as a herd of jackals. Well, if we behave like jackals, we'll kill people off and we'll probably just raise up others. We have really got to encourage skills of getting up close to people and pointing out to them what is flawed. Get to know your MP, and I say not so much over the bill, but over the bigger picture, your local councillors as well, because they do not understand home education. Neither do civil servants. And how are they going to understand it if we leave it to those who are lobbying to wipe out home education to be the only people in their ears? So we need to do that.
I've got Iowa waiting to ask you a nice question. Come on up.
Carry on.
Come on up.
So I have my children on the register because Matilda was due to go to school and then I took her off the register. So with Matilda, who's now 10, I've always been asked to produce a slim report 1 year after. And I'm in York, by the way. And because it was the pandemic and Conrad was now 8, I thought, you know what, they'll think I'm hiding one child and only educating the other. What I'm trying to say is some people home educating are registered and some aren't. And it's a question of whether they bothered or whether their kids were in school for a bit. You know, if you have them in nursery, they'll be on the register. So if you not apply for school places. So I would very much like not to have to send the report. At the moment, I'm very happy that it's only an annual report that's quite slim, just about 7 questions, no proof or anything required. So I did write to my MP and say, please don't impose any more. But listening to Tristram there, I think, well, basically they don't have a right to ask for anything, but it's just that balance of how do you keep them appeased? Yeah, what do you think? Should we, as registered home editors, try and argue with our MP against it, or yeah?
The way the law was and still is, educationally speaking, is the local authority only had a right to inquire into your private family life if they had reason to believe there was a problem. The 2019 guidance set education law slightly to the side and went down the safeguarding law of the 2004, I think it is, Children Act, and built on this narrative of proactive safeguarding. And they're trying to say, and I think I'm very glad that in the Portsmouth case, the judge spelled out there was no challenge to that guidance. I think there is still a place to question whether the local authority has a right to proactively, without any evidence about you and your family, to come and prying its nose into your life. And I think that is a key issue. And it comes back a little bit together with the way the bill's been written, which is badly, as we've said. It comes back together in that sense, because where we're going there is we want this data from you. And this is why the conversation with Tristram was very timely, because his main point is this: unless they can justify why they want this data, they shouldn't be collecting it, because unless they can justify in the courts that this data is essential to you, then you're only, if they want data off you and they can't justify it, you have to give your consent, and they should not be able to penalize you for consent. So basic point, at the moment it's written, as Alison pointed out, as Tristram pointed out, as I'm going to point out again, there is no decision on what data they can collect. It uses this catch-all phrase: in the future, the Secretary of State can decide what data they want to collect. And the implication being, if you refuse to give them the data, they can refuse to register your child and therefore serve as school attendance order. Worse than that, the local authorities, on top of whatever the Secretary of Education decides he wants by the way of data, they can add to that list. So that is a very open thing, and they are wanting data that protected characteristics, things that they should not be asking us about. And so this is much wider than home educators. Alison, you've had a mitt up for a while.
Okay, so on that point, with my talk this morning, we were talking about how the language has changed and how they change the way people think. So they're changing the interpretation. It's a wrong interpretation of law. So the phrase that the local government association came up with was a register. I'm paraphrasing here. A register would help councils monitor how children are being educated and prevent them from disappearing from the oversight of services designed to keep them safe. And this is the key thing. Those services are not designed to proactively keep them safe. They are not designed for that. We can't have a system of that, because then people would be going to jail because they missed something. It's just not possible. That's like a police intrusive state thing. What we do have is a law that reacts, that allows authorities to react if there is evidence. So much like your colleague was saying about if there is evidence of harm, they can share information. There's got to be evidence. There's got to be at least the suspicion, and a founded suspicion, not just, oh, I don't like the colour of his trousers, or his hair's a bit of a funny cut, or whatever it is. There's got to be the reasonable suspicion that something untoward is going on before they even make an inquiry. And it's always been written like that. We don't have Napoleonic law in this country. Under Napoleonic law, you have to prove your innocence. We don't have that. What we have is a system where authorities, courts, whatever, have to show that there is something wrong before they do something. We cannot allow this fundamental change in the attitude to happen through attempting to mess with our primary legislation, and therefore mess with our families and cause an enormous amount of harm.
Thank you, Alison. Randall, we've not got any more questions at the moment. Do you want to?
I think we've exhausted them all, but I'm sure we can provoke somebody to come up with something, folks.
Yeah, I mean, I put in the chat, to me, and this actually did happen to me. as a young child, I was stopped by police walking down the road, and they demanded my name, my address, and where I was going to, where I had come from, and who had accompanied me for the entire duration of my walk. And it felt very intrusive, and I felt really put upon. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that, you know, as a child, if you don't know your rights, you don't question it. You just see somebody of authority.
Amy, that was because you were home educated and you were out during school hours, I'm presuming.
No, this was after school. I'd gone to pick my sister up from the TAs.
Wow.
So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Randall.
And it did happen, there was an athlete, a female athlete, who was driving, who was a passenger in a BMW or something not so long ago. The police stopped the car, was rough with them, her and the driver. They had no reason other than that both driver and passenger were black. That hit the headlines. I used to do detached youth work in the middle of Manchester. One of the young men I know worked at the abattoir. Early one morning, he was walking to work. He was stopped by the police. Where are you going at this time in the morning? I'm going to work. What do you do for work? I kill pigs. Those who know the street language will get that one. Those who aren't smiling don't. Pigs is what the locals call the police. Okay, perhaps at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, that was a fair question. But actually, it should not be. And it is not a fair question to say, on one hand, the department tell us there is no indication that home education is a safeguarding risk. But the conversation coming from the local authorities, the latest one, if you haven't seen it circulating on social media, a week ago, the local government association put out a briefing, and it basically says the bill doesn't go far enough. We want it amended so local authority staff have the powers to enter homes to see children. Now that is a total arrogance. And well, in a way, I hope somebody proposes it in the thing, because we really do need the horror of this to get home to people. And I'll pull in Megan Ann's question here about, can we use the experience and legislation from the named person on Isle of Man to stop this bill? I think we should be doing. I mean, we all know the quote from the named person judgment about the first thing a totalitarian regime does is to try and get between parents and children. I think what frustrated the Isle of Man situation in the first place was this matter of privacy. Incidentally, what Tristan didn't mention is when the minister finally announced they were dropping the bill, he was asked about home education, and he said, and bear in mind that their legal system is basically based on the English one, and their education laws basically reflect the 1996 Education Act. He said there is enough power in the existing act to enable us to provide the supervision for home educated children that's needed. Now, they've never had to do it, but if that is their opinion in the Isle of Man, why isn't it the opinion of the DFE in this country? And our position must be that the Education Act gives them all that they need. So in that sense, there are things to learn. And it is, how much do we value our privacy? Going back to Iona's comment earlier, the data you give a local authority, if you've deregistered your child from school, has always got to be on a voluntary basis. There is no compulsion for parents to do it. It becomes very different under this bill when it becomes compulsion. And we need to help others, politicians, and the wider public understand our concerns that we are, as it stands, we are going to be compelled to give data that we shouldn't be giving in order to be able to exercise our legal responsibility. And we've got to learn from these. We've got to learn from other cases. And we've got to find ways of spreading it out so that the wider population gets involved. And I've said this more than once previously, I'll say it again. We have a lot of opportunity at the moment, not just the bill, but last autumn in the wake of COVID, the Children's Commissioner for England started saying she wants a database of every child in England to be set up. And I'm using the phrase basically so they can track and trace every one of them. They want to know details, and it's all in the name of keeping children safe. Now, the evidence is the children they've got data on that they do have in schools and in other places, in children's homes, are not being kept safe, even though they've got the data. So we've got to be saying that, but the strength of the named person scheme, or the weakness in a sense, was it wasn't just home educators. Alison Price and others spotted it would be negative for home educators, but they were able to take it outside of home educating circles and find a louder voice. And that is what's got to be done in this case. Now, it is being done. Defend Digital Me has been set up for a long time because it was concerned about what is happening with children's data. They've revealed that in some schools they were taking children's fingerprints without the consent of the parents, without informing the parents. They now also are on board, and the Children's Commissioner narrative has motivated this in a lot of ways with defending the data of home educated children. And they've formed a coalition called Counting Children. And it's not in favour of counting children, it's putting forward the dangers. And really, they are possibly one of our best chances of getting this narrative to the wider public. And we've got to see that this isn't just a fight for us. I need to let people come in. At this moment of time, part of our trouble is we think, and some people do think, that getting at home educators is the thin end of the wedge. It's not. We are the last stand of parental responsibility. And most parents do not understand how much they have conceded to the state in exchange for a state babysitting service. Mm. And so now we've got to say to them, do you really want the state knowing absolutely everything about your children? Do you want them approaching you as if you're a danger to your children rather than their best nurturers and protectors? So
thank you,
I'm going to shut up.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interject there because we're on the hour. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. Alison's just answering the question for Nicola about whether the legal avenues are being sought to try and fight against the schools bill, and yes, they are. Thank you, Randall. Would you like to say a last few words before I stop the recording?
I just say this is serious. If people want to talk about it, you can get in touch with me in the various ways. There's a lot of us looking at it. I do think we do need to look at what lawyers are saying. I do know some legal people who are looking at it. And we have to get the DFE to see that it's a legal colander. It's full of holes and it should not go on the books. And at the moment, I think they don't have the evidence. I put in a freedom of information request about a statement in the 2019 guidance where they said they had considerable evidence that many home educators were not receiving an education. And the only thing they could tell me was that a lot of local authorities had expressed concerns that they might not be. That is not data. About a month ago, Tristram, who he was talking to, very wisely got his local MP, who wasn't interested at first, but he's worked on him to put on a series of five written questions. And one of them was about what research does the Department of Education have into the need for this bill? And they came back and basically said, we can't do any research because we don't have the information about the people to do the research with. So in other words, they don't have the research. Those facts at least is a good legal argument. I don't want it to go to court. I want them to hear that argument and say, oh yeah, it's right. I'll stop it there.
Thank you.